Tonight, I find myself remembering the warm scent of fermented dough drifting through ancient Egyptian bakeries, the way wild yeasts danced invisibly through Mediterranean air, and how the slow bubble of living cultures shaped 5,000 years of human sustenance. This is history as it was lived and hurried, unpolished, real. If this quiet approach to bread's forgotten past helps you unwind, a like would mean a lot. Subscribe if you'd like to join me for more slow journeys through culinary history. Tell me in the comments where tonight finds you listening and what draws you to these stories of simple foods that changed the world. Dim the lights. Let's drift back to the Nile Delta where it all began. I remember when bread was still a mystery, before scientists peered through microscopes at dancing yeasts, before machines sliced perfect uniform loaves, before we understood the invisible world that transforms flour and water into something alive. Back then, in the time when pyramids cast their first shadows across desert sand, bread was magic. The story I want to tell you tonight stretches across 50 centuries, following a single thread, thinner than spider silk, more enduring than stone. It's the story of a living culture passed from hand to hand, generation to generation, surviving wars and disasters and the relentless march of industrial progress. It's older than written history, more traveled than any explorer, more resilient than any empire. Some call it sourdough. The miners of 1849 called it mother dough. The ancient Egyptians had no name for it. At Olet was simply bread, the staff of life, the gift of the gods. But I remember it by what it truly is: a partnership between human hands and wild nature, a collaboration so ancient that it shaped civilization itself. The living cultures that bubble quietly on kitchen counters around the world tonight carry within them the memory of every baker who ever tended them. They remember the warm stone ovens of Roman pastors, the desperate campfires of gold rush miners, the heroic rescue from burning San Francisco bakeries. They carry the taste of history itself. This is not a story of grand conquests or mighty kings, though pharaohs and emperors play their parts. This is the story of something smaller, quieter, more essential, the story of how we learned to capture wildness, to nurture life, to transform the simplest ingredients into sustenance that could feed both body and soul. I remember the accident that started it all, somewhere along the Nile when the world was young. A forgotten bowl, a warm day, the patient work of invisible creatures in the air. From that single moment of serendipity grew an art, a science, a tradition that would follow humanity to every corner of the earth. The thread runs unbroken still. In research laboratories and rustic kitchens, in massive commercial bakeries and tiny apartment counters, the same ancient dance continues. Wild yeasts and bacteria, flour and water, time and patience. The recipe hasn't changed in 5,000 years. Tonight, as you settle into the darkness, let me show you where that thread began and how it winds through the long story of human civilization. Let me tell you about the bakers who guarded their secrets, the miners who carried living dough against their hearts, the ordinary people who kept an ancient art alive through the darkest times. This is the story of sourdough, just as food, but as living history, as bridge between past and present, as proof that some things endure not because they're preserved in museums, but because they're loved, tended, shared, and passed along with careful hands and patient hearts. The story begins in Egypt, in the warm morning air beside the Nile, where someone left a bowl of grain paste in the sun a little too long, and discovered that sometimes the most beautiful accidents are the ones that change the world forever. I remember the morning it happened, though no scribe was there to record it. No monument was raised to mark the spot. It was just another day along the Nile, the kind of day when the sun climbed slowly over the eastern desert, casting long shadows across the fertile delta where humanity was learning, grain by grain, how to feed itself. The air smelled of river mud and growing things, of the sweet dust that settled on everything when grain was ground between stones. For 3,000 years already, people had been mixing that ground grain with water, making flat cakes that would sustain them through the day's work. Hard bread, dense bread, bread that filled the belly but asked nothing of the imagination. This was how it had always been done, how it would always be done, until the morning when someone, perhaps a young apprentice, perhaps an overworked baker, left a bowl of grain paste sitting in the warm Egyptian sun. Back then, bread was simple arithmetic. Take emmer wheat, the ancient grain that grew so readily in the Nile's gift of soil. Grind it between stones until your arms ached. Add water from the great river, mix it into dough, shape it flat, cook it on hot stones. Eat it while it was still warm, if you were lucky, or let it harden into something that would keep you alive another day if you were not. I remember how that forgotten bowl must have looked as the hours passed. The surface of the wet grain paste catching flies, perhaps, or gathering the fine dust that drifted constantly through those ancient settlements. The sun beating down, warming the mixture, creating the perfect conditions for something that had been happening in the wild for millions of years, something that was about to be captured, domesticated, transformed into one of humanity's greatest partnerships. The wild yeasts were already there, drifting invisibly through the warm air like microscopic nomads. They had been there all along, settling on grape skins and tree bark, on the surfaces of every living thing, waiting patiently for the right moment, the right conditions, the right mixture of moisture and nourishment to begin their ancient work. And now, in this forgotten bowl beside the Nile, they found what they had been searching for. I can see the first tentative bubbles forming in that abandoned paste. Not dramatic, not theatrical, just small, almost apologetic bubbles, rising to the surface and popping softly. The mixture beginning to smell different, not unpleasant, but changed, alive. The invisible creatures in the air had found their way home, and they were beginning the slow work of transformation. Perhaps it was a child who noticed first. Children notice things that adults, busy with the serious work of survival, often miss. The way the abandoned dough had swollen slightly, grown soft and spongy, instead of hardening in the heat. The new smell, yeasty and complex, that rose from its surface. The way it seemed almost to breathe, rising and falling in gentle rhythm. When the baker returned, for surely someone did return, eventually, to clean up the forgotten mess, they found something unprecedented. The simple paste had become something else entirely, something that yielded to the touch like living flesh, something that exhaled strange and pleasant aromas, something that seemed to pulse with invisible life. And here is where the story becomes miraculous, not because of what happened next, but because of what didn't happen. The baker didn't throw the transformed dough away. They didn't dismiss it as spoiled, ruined, dangerous. Instead, with the kind of curiosity that marks the true innovator, they decided to see what would happen if they cooked this living dough, this breathing paste that had been touched by invisible hands. I remember the first loaf, though no one alive today could possibly remember it. The way it must have smelled as it cooked, releasing aromas that had never before drifted across the Egyptian morning. The way it rose in the heat, puffing up like a small miracle, creating pockets of air within itself. The first bite, tentative and uncertain, revealing flavors that were both familiar and entirely new. The bread was lighter than anything they had ever tasted. Softer, more complex, it had a subtle tang, a depth of flavor that plain flat bread could never achieve. It was, in every way, an improvement on 5,000 years of human bread-making tradition. And the baker, standing there beside the Nile with this impossible loaf in their hands, had no idea they were holding the future. But the Egyptians were uniquely positioned to understand what they had discovered. They were already master brewers, creating beer from grain and wild fermentation. They understood the mysterious process by which simple ingredients could be transformed by invisible forces into something far greater than the sum of their parts. They had been working with wild yeasts for generations without knowing what they were, calling the process magic or gift of the gods, but understanding its practical applications. Where the Sumerians had developed their bapia, a soggy beer bread that was barely edible and used primarily as a brewing ingredient, the Egyptians saw something different. They saw potential. They saw a way to improve not just the taste of their daily bread, but its very nature. They saw a partnership with the invisible world that could be cultivated, encouraged, controlled. The crucial insight came slowly through patient observation and careful experimentation. The transformed dough could be divided. A portion could be baked immediately, providing that day's miraculous light bread, but a small piece could be saved, kept alive with regular additions of fresh flour and water, maintained like a small domestic animal that required feeding and attention. This saved portion, this starter, though they had no such word for it, yet contained within its bubbly mass all the wild creatures that had created the first transformation. Feed it properly, keep it at the right temperature, and it would continue its work indefinitely. It would transform tomorrow's dough, and the day after that, and the day after that, for as long as someone was willing to tend it with patient hands. I remember the first time someone successfully maintained a starter for a full week, then a month, then a season. The growing realization that they had captured something eternal, something that could outlive any individual baker, any single generation. They had domesticated fermentation itself, transforming a random accident into a reproducible art. The knowledge spread slowly through the Egyptian settlements along the river, not as dramatic revolution, but as quiet evolution. Baker teaching baker, parent teaching child, the careful passing along of hard-won wisdom about temperature and timing, about the care and feeding of these living cultures that could transform simple ingredients into daily miracles. Within a generation, the art had been perfected. Egyptian bakers understood the rhythm of fermentation, the patience required, the careful balance of ingredients and time that produced the best results. They had moved beyond accidental discovery into intentional craft, though they still had no real understanding of the invisible creatures that made it all possible. The wild yeasts that had settled in that first forgotten bowl continued their work, generation after generation, in baker after baker's carefully tended starter. They were the same species that had been fermenting fruit and grain in the wild for millions of years, but now they had found a new kind of home. A partnership with human hands that would carry them across continents and centuries, that would give them security and sustenance in exchange for their ancient gift of transformation. And so bread became something more than mere sustenance. It became a collaboration between the visible and invisible worlds, between human skill and wild nature, between the present moment and the endless continuity of life itself. The accident beside the Nile had become the foundation of an art that would endure for millennia, feeding empires and surviving their fall, adapting to new climates and new grains and new human hands, but always maintaining the essential relationship that began on that warm morning when someone forgot to clean up their mess. The thread was begun, the partnership was established, and somewhere in the fertile delta of the Nile, the first sourdough starter bubbled quietly in its clay vessel, carrying within its humble mass the power to change the world. I remember when bread became more than food, when the simple loaves that had begun as happy accident transformed into something sacred, something that connected the mortal world to the realm of the gods themselves. In ancient Egypt, where the Nile's annual flood brought both life and mystery, bread took on meanings that reached far beyond the satisfaction of hunger. The transformation had happened slowly, almost imperceptibly. One generation discovered the miracle of leavened bread, the next perfected its making. But it was the third generation, perhaps, that looked at these risen loaves cooling in the morning air, and saw not just sustenance, but symbol, not just food, but the very essence of life itself, captured in grain and given form by invisible forces that could only be divine. I can feel the weight of that realization, the moment when simple bakers understood they were working with something holy. The bread that rose in their ovens was performing the same miracle that happened every year when the Nile flooded, when dead-seeming seeds, buried in mud, suddenly burst into green life. The grain died to become bread, just as Osiris had died to become the lord of the underworld. The bread rose from the heat of the oven like the sun rising each morning from the eastern horizon. Everything was connected. Everything was sacred, and bread stood at the center of it all. In the great bakeries that served the pyramid builders, bread became the measure of a man's worth. The workers who hauled limestone blocks under the desert sun received their daily rations, 10 loaves and 2 jars of beer for each man, every day, without fail. This was not charity, but payment. Recognition that the civilization rising along the Nile could not exist without the workers who built it, and those workers could not exist without the bread that sustained them. I remember the rhythm of those massive bakeries, the way they operated like well-orchestrated temples dedicated to the service of human need. Before dawn, when the eastern sky was still dark, the fires would be lit in the great ovens. The sound of grinding would begin as teams of workers crushed grain between stones, their movements synchronized by songs that helped pass the long hours of labor. The air would fill with the dust of emmer and barley, a golden haze that caught the first rays of sunlight streaming through the bakery doorways. The dough-makers worked with their feet as much as their hands, kneading vast quantities of dough in wooden troughs, large enough for a man to stand in. The fermented starter, passed down from baker to baker like a treasured inheritance, was mixed into each new batch, bringing with it the promise of lightness, flavor, the mysterious transformation that turned simple ingredients into something approaching magic. But it was in the temples that bread's true significance revealed itself. Here, in the cool stone chambers where priests performed the daily rituals that kept the world in balance. Bread became the offering that connected earth to heaven, mortal to divine. The offering tables were piled high with loaves of every shape and size, arranged in careful patterns that spoke a language older than hieroglyphs. The priests understood what many have forgotten, that the act of making bread is itself a kind of prayer. The patient mixing, the waiting for fermentation, the careful shaping, the trust in fire and time to complete the transformation, all of this required the same qualities that made for successful communion with the gods: patience, faith, attention to detail, respect for processes larger than individual understanding. I remember the story they told about Isis, the great goddess who searched the length of Egypt for the scattered pieces of her murdered husband Osiris. How she gathered each fragment with loving hands, how she breathed life back into the assembled body, how her tears of grief became the annual flood that brought fertility to the land. The priests saw in this myth the same pattern they witnessed daily in their bakeries. The grain scattered and gathered, ground down and reformed, given life through fermentation, transformed by fire into something that could nourish and sustain. Isis became known as the divine baker, the goddess who could take what was broken and make it whole, who could transform death into life with patient, loving hands. The connection was not metaphorical, but literal, physical, tangible. The bread that rose in temple ovens was the body of Osiris, reborn daily through the sacred partnership between human skill and divine intervention. The mythology deepened with each passing generation. Bread became the food of immortality, the sustenance that would carry the dead through their journey in the afterworld. Every tomb, from the grandest pyramid to the humblest grave, contained actual loaves, carefully wrapped and preserved for the long journey ahead. Archaeologists today still find these ancient loaves hard as stone but recognizable, testament to a faith that understood eternal life in the most practical, tangible terms. The hieroglyphic symbols for bread and beer, when written together, meant meal or all good things. But more than that, they became a greeting, a blessing, a wish for prosperity shared between friends. To say bread and beer to someone was to invoke the basic necessities of life, to acknowledge the fundamental partnership between grain and fermentation that made civilization possible. I remember the funeral texts, carved deep into stone walls, that spoke of bread in language usually reserved for the most precious treasures. May you have bread in abundance. The inscriptions read, "May your table never be empty. May the bread of eternal life sustain you through all your journeys." These were not metaphors, but statements of practical theology, expressions of a worldview that saw bread as literally divine, as the substance through which gods and mortals shared the same essential nourishment. The bakers who worked in temple service understood their sacred responsibility. They were not merely preparing food, but participating in the daily miracle by which life sustained itself. Their starters were maintained with religious precision, fed at the same time each day, kept at the same temperature, treated with the same careful attention that priests gave to the sacred fires that burned continuously in temple sanctuaries. Each loaf that emerged from the temple ovens carried within it the accumulated wisdom of generations. The wild yeasts that caused the dough to rise were the same species that had been transforming grain for thousands of years, but now they worked in partnership with human intention, guided by knowledge passed down from baker to baker like sacred scripture. The bread they produced was both ancient and immediate, both timeless and present, both ordinary and miraculous. The shapes of ritual bread spoke their own language. Round loaves represented the sun, the daily cycle of death and rebirth that governed all life. Spiral-shaped bread echoed the coiled serpent that surrounded the world, the endless cycle of time itself. Triangular loaves pointed toward the pyramids, those massive monuments to eternal life that dominated the horizon. Every shape carried meaning, every form was intentional, every loaf was both food and message. In the workers' villages that surrounded the great monuments, families maintained their own smaller traditions, their own relationships with the sacred bread that sustained their daily lives. Mothers taught daughters the proper way to tend the family starter, how to read the signs that indicated when fermentation was complete, how to shape loaves that would feed not just the body but the soul. Children learned to treat bread with respect, never to waste even the smallest crumb, to understand that they held in their hands the gift of life itself. The festivals that marked the agricultural year were celebrations of bread as much as grain. When the Nile's annual flood receded, revealing fresh, fertile soil, the first new wheat would be ground and mixed with starter saved from the previous year's harvest. The bread baked from this mixture represented continuity, the unbroken chain that connected each season to the last, each generation to those that came before. I remember how the aroma of baking bread must have drifted across the Egyptian landscape in those ancient times, carrying with it all the accumulated meaning of centuries. It was the smell of home, of security, of civilization itself. But it was also the smell of mystery, of transformation, of partnership between human skill and forces too subtle to see but too essential to ignore. The wild yeasts that had first colonized that forgotten bowl beside the Nile had become, in their way, Egyptian citizens. They had adapted to the climate, learned to work with local grains, developed preferences for certain temperatures and feeding schedules. They had become domesticated without losing their essential wildness, tamed without losing their power to transform, controlled without losing their mystery. And in the great temples where priests performed the daily rituals that kept the world in balance, bread served as the bridge between seen and unseen, between mortal and eternal, between the simple satisfaction of hunger and the complex nourishment of the soul. Each loaf that blessed the offering tables carried within its risen structure the same pattern that governed all life, death, and resurrection, dissolution and reformation, the eternal cycle by which what appears to end becomes the beginning of something new. The bread of the gods was the same bread that fed the workers, the same bread that sustained families, the same bread that began with wild yeasts settling in a forgotten bowl. But meaning, like fermentation, transforms simple ingredients into something far greater than their individual parts. And in ancient Egypt, beside the life-giving Nile, bread had become not just the staff of life, but the very substance of eternity itself. I remember the sound, more than anything else, the sharp crack of clay expanding in sudden heat, the hiss of steam escaping from fresh loaves, the soft thud of wooden paddles against oven walls. In the great bakeries that served Egypt's monuments, the rhythm of bread-making had become as precise and choreographed as any temple ritual. But it was built on innovations so simple they seem almost inevitable in hindsight. The morning began before dawn, always before dawn. in the blue-black darkness that preceded sunrise, when the desert air still held the coolness of night, the bakers would arrive at their workstations like priests approaching an altar. The fires had to be built first, carefully, methodically, using dried reeds and palm fronds that burned hot and clean. The timing was everything the ovens needed to reach precisely the right temperature by the time the day's first batch of dough was ready for baking. I can see them moving through those massive bakeries, perhaps 20 or 30 bakers working in perfect synchronization. Each man knew his role, had learned it from childhood, had inherited not just the techniques, but the timing, the intuitive sense of when dough had risen enough, when ovens were hot enough, when the moment had come to commit the day's work to fire and hope. The grain came first, always the grain, emmer wheat, that ancient variety that grew so well in the Nile's fertile soil, arrived in great sacks that required 2 men to carry. The grinding was done by teams working in shifts, using massive stone querns that could reduce a day's supply of grain to flour in the space of a few hours. The work was hard, repetitive, but essentially in the sound of stone against stone. Grain being crushed to powder formed the background rhythm against which all other bakery work was performed, but it was the kneading that truly tested a baker's strength and skill. In wooden troughs large enough for a grown man to stand in, teams of workers mixed the day's dough using not just their hands but their feet, their entire bodies. The quantities were enormous enough dough to feed thousands of workers, to stock the offering tables of a dozen temples, to provision the households of nobles and craftsmen throughout the region. I remember watching them work, these ancient bakers whose names have been lost to time, but whose skills shaped the foundations of civilization. They added the precious starter to each batch with careful precision, knowing that too little would produce dense, heavy bread, while too much would create loaves that rose too quickly and then collapsed. The fermented culture they added carried within it the accumulated wisdom of generations' wild yeasts and bacteria that had learned over centuries to work in perfect harmony with Egyptian grain, Egyptian climate, Egyptian hands. The waiting was as important as the working. After the dough was mixed and divided, it had to rest, had to be given time for the invisible transformation that would make it ready for the fire. The bakers could read the signs the way the surface of the dough began to show small bubbles, the slightly sweet smell that indicated fermentation was proceeding properly, the gentle swelling that meant the wild yeasts were beginning their ancient work. While they waited, other preparations continued. The clay molds that would shape the day's bread were prepared with careful attention to detail. These were not simple bowls, but carefully crafted vessels, cone-shaped, designed to create loaves that would bake evenly and completely. The clay was local, dug from deposits along the Nile, mixed with chopped straw to prevent cracking, shaped by potters who understood that their work was as essential to bread-making as the work of the bakers themselves. The innovation that made Egyptian bread possible was elegantly simple. Instead of trying to build massive stone ovens that would take hours to heat and days to cool, the bakers created portable cooking chambers using these conical clay molds. A loaf of shaped dough would be placed inside each mold, and then the mold itself would be placed in a pit lined with glowing coals. I can see the careful choreography of the baking process, teams of workers tending dozens of fire pits simultaneously, each pit containing multiple clay molds, each mold containing a single precious loaf. The molds were then covered with hot ash and glowing embers, creating a miniature oven around each piece of bread. The clay held the heat, distributed it evenly, created the perfect environment for the dough to complete its transformation into bread. The timing required intuition as much as knowledge. Too little heat, and the bread would remain dense and gummy in the center. Too much heat applied too quickly, and the outside would burn, while the inside stayed raw. The experienced bakers could tell by smell, by sound, by the subtle changes in the way steam escaped from the clay molds, exactly when each loaf was ready. When the moment came, the molds were carefully lifted from the coals, using long wooden tools, their surfaces glowing red-hot from the fire. The clay would be cracked open like an eggshell, revealing the treasure within a perfectly baked loaf, golden brown, fragrant with the complex aromas that only fermented dough can produce when touched by fire. But the Egyptian bakers were not content with plain bread. They had discovered that the fermentation process that made their bread rise could also carry flavors, could distribute throughout the loaf whatever additions they chose to include. Dates were popular, their sweetness complementing the subtle sourness of the fermented dough. Figs added their own complex flavors, their seeds providing texture and interest. Coriander seeds brought a warm spice that seemed to enhance the natural flavors of the grain itself. I remember the social hierarchy that expressed itself even in bread. The finest white loaves, made from grain that had been sifted multiple times to remove every trace of bran, were reserved for the wealthy, for the priests. For the pharaoh's own table, these breads were works of art as much as food, shaped into elaborate forms, enriched with honey and oils, baked in the smallest clay molds to create perfect individual portions. The workers received a different kind of bread, darker, denser, made from flour that included more of the grain's natural components, but this bread was in many ways more nutritious, more satisfying, better suited to sustain men performing the hard, physical labor of building monuments that would last for millennia. The bakers understood, perhaps better than anyone, that different breads served different purposes, that variety was not luxury, but necessity. The clay molds themselves told stories. After being used for baking, they would be broken open to release the bread, and the shards would be discarded in great piles behind the bakeries. Archaeologists today dig through these ancient refuse heaps and find in the broken clay a record of daily life more detailed than any royal inscription. The size of the molds, the quality of the clay, the techniques used in their making, all of this speaks to the skill and organization of the bakers who fed ancient Egypt. The ovens required constant attention, constant adjustment. The temperature had to be monitored not by instruments which didn't exist, but by experience, by the accumulated knowledge of men who had spent their lives learning to read the subtle signs that indicated when conditions were perfect for baking. A handful of flour tossed into the pit would sizzle and brown at exactly the right rate. The color of the flames would shift from yellow to blue at precisely the moment when the heat was ready. Even the sound of the fire would change, becoming deeper, more sustained, when the coals had reached the proper temperature. The rhythm of production never stopped. While one batch of bread was baking in the clay molds, the next batch of dough was being shaped and prepared. While that dough was rising, fresh grain was being ground for the following day's work. The starter cultures were fed and maintained on a schedule as regular as the rising and setting of the sun. Ensuring that the chain of fermentation would never be broken, I remember the satisfaction that must have filled those ancient bakeries when the day's work was complete. Hundreds of loaves cooling in the desert air, their golden surfaces still warm from the fire, their complex aromas drifting across the workers' villages and temple compounds. The clay molds broken and discarded, their purpose fulfilled, ready to be replaced by fresh ones shaped by the potters who worked in careful partnership with the bakers. The bread that emerged from those conical clay ovens fed the civilization that built the pyramids, that carved the great temples, that developed the art of writing and the science of mathematics. It was bread created through innovation and tradition, working hand in hand through techniques refined over generations, but flexible enough to adapt to changing needs and circumstances. The wild yeasts that had first settled in that forgotten bowl beside the Nile had found their way into every bakery in Egypt, carried in starters that were shared, traded, passed down from master to apprentice like precious inheritance. They had learned to work with emmer, wheat, and barley, with dates and figs and coriander seeds, with clay molds and fire pits and the skilled hands of bakers who understood that their craft was both practical art and sacred duty. And in the evening, when the last fires had died down and the final loaves had been delivered to the households and temples and work sites they were meant to serve, the bakers would clean their tools and prepare for the next day's work, knowing that they were part of something larger than individual effort or tradition, a craft, a partnership between human skill and wild nature that would endure long after their own names were forgotten. I remember the salt wind carrying new aromas across the Mediterranean, the scent of leavened bread drifting from Greek islands where olive trees cast silver shadows and where men who had learned Egyptian secrets were teaching them to others. The knowledge had travelled slowly at first, carried by merchants and sailors, by refugees and adventurers, by all the restless souls who moved across the ancient world, carrying with them not just goods and stories, but the invisible treasures of technique and tradition. By the time 800 years had passed since that first accidental fermentation beside the Nile, the Greeks had made the Egyptian art their own. They had adapted the techniques to work with their different grains, their different climate, their different sense of what bread should be and do. The wild yeasts that had once known only the warm banks of the Nile had learned to work in the cooler air of Athenian mornings, in the humid coastal regions where fishermen brought their daily catch, in the mountain villages where shepherds tended their flocks among the olive groves. I can see the Greek bakers at their work, men who had inherited not just recipes but an understanding of fermentation that went deeper than mere technique. They had learned from Egyptian teachers, perhaps, or from Greeks who had travelled to Memphis and Thebes and brought back with them the secrets of leavened bread. But they were not mere imitators, they were innovators in their own right, adapting ancient wisdom to new circumstances, new needs, new possibilities. The Greek approach to bread-making reflected their broader philosophy, their love of proportion and harmony, their belief that the best results came from understanding the underlying principles rather than simply following prescribed procedures. Where the Egyptians had developed their techniques through centuries of practical experience, the Greeks brought to bread-making the same analytical spirit that they applied to mathematics and astronomy, to sculpture and architecture. They observed that fermentation worked best at certain temperatures, and they built their bakeries with careful attention to ventilation and heat retention. They noticed that different grains produced different flavors and textures in the finished bread, and they began experimenting with mixtures, with combinations that would produce exactly the characteristics they desired. They understood that the timing of fermentation could be controlled, speeded up or slowed down depending on temperature and feeding schedule, and they used this knowledge to create more predictable, more consistent results. But it was the Romans who truly transformed bread from craft to industry, who took the Greek innovations and scaled them up to feed an empire. The transformation began in 171 BC, in the aftermath of a war that most Romans thought of in terms of military conquest and political advantage. The Third Macedonian War had ended with Roman victory, with the defeat of King Perseus and the effective end of Macedonian independence. But among the spoils of that victory were human treasures that would prove more valuable than gold or silver. The Greek bakers who were brought to Rome as part of the post-war settlement were called pistors, and they carried with them skills that would revolutionize Roman food culture. These were not slaves captured in battle, but craftsmen, professionals, men who understood bread-making as both art and science. They brought with them not just techniques but tools, not just recipes but an entire approach to the organization of commercial baking that the Romans had never seen before. I remember the first Roman bakeries that the pistors established. Modest affairs compared to the massive industrial operations that would develop later, but revolutionary for their time, where Roman families had traditionally ground their grain at home and baked their own flat breads. These Greek craftsmen offered something entirely different: professional service, consistent quality, bread that was better than anything most Romans had ever tasted. The Romans, with their genius for organization and their appetite for efficiency, quickly recognized the value of what the Greek bakers offered. Within a generation, the pistors had been not just accepted but embraced, integrated into Roman society as respected professionals rather than foreign curiosities. Their bakeries became gathering places, social centers where neighbors met to collect their daily bread and exchange the news of the day. The technical innovations came quickly. The Greeks had brought with them knowledge of oven construction that went far beyond the Egyptian clay mold system. They understood how to build permanent ovens using stone and brick, ovens that could retain heat for hours, that could bake multiple batches of bread without needing to be reheated. The Roman engineers, never content to simply copy what others had done, began improving on these designs almost immediately. The furnace, the great domed oven that became the standard for Roman bakeries, was a masterpiece of practical engineering. Built of brick and stone, lined with materials that could withstand intense heat. These ovens could be heated to the proper temperature using wood fires built directly inside the baking chamber. When the fuel had burned down to coals and ash, the residue would be swept out, and the retained heat in the oven walls would provide the perfect environment for baking dozens of loaves at once. But the Romans didn't stop with one oven design. They developed the testum, a portable clay cover that could be placed over bread baking on a flat hearth, creating a miniature oven that could be used in smaller operations. They created the thermospodium, a more complex oven system that could maintain different temperatures in different chambers, allowing bakers to prepare various types of bread simultaneously. I remember the rhythm of a Roman bakery in full operation, the careful choreography of professional bread production. The day began before dawn, just as it had in Egypt, but with a scale and efficiency that would have amazed the ancient bakers beside the Nile. Teams of workers, each with specialized roles, moved through the production process with mechanical precision. The grinding was done by donkeys now, walking in endless circles around massive millstones that could process far more grain than human workers could handle. The patient animals, blindfolded so they wouldn't become dizzy, plodded their steady circles from sunrise to sunset, their hooves wearing smooth paths in the stone floors. The sound of their movement, the grinding of stone against stone, the gentle commands of their handlers, created a background rhythm that spoke of abundance, of civilization secure enough to feed itself with confidence and consistency. The Roman bakers had learned to maintain their starters with scientific precision, understanding that consistency in fermentation was the key to consistency in the finished product. They kept detailed records of temperatures, timing, feeding schedules, treating their living cultures with the same careful attention that Roman engineers applied to aqueducts and roads. The wild yeasts and bacteria that had begun their partnership with humanity beside the Nile had found in Roman bakeries a new level of security, of understanding, of respect for their essential role in the transformation of grain into bread. The social implications of professional baking were profound. Where bread making had once been women's work, performed in individual households with techniques passed from mother to daughter, it now became men's work, performed in commercial establishments with techniques guarded as trade secrets. The pistols formed guilds, professional associations that regulated quality, controlled prices, protected the interests of their members against competition and exploitation. But Roman society, being what it was, even bread reflected the rigid hierarchy that defined every aspect of life in the empire. The wealthy ate panis candidus, the white bread made from flour that had been sifted so carefully that only the finest particles remained. This bread was light, pale, almost sweet in its purity and expensive enough that only the upper classes could afford it regularly. The poor made do with darker breads, loaves made from flour that included more of the grain's natural components, that was less processed, less refined, but also more nutritious and more filling. These breads had stronger flavors, denser textures, but they provided the energy and sustenance that working Romans needed to fuel their daily labor. I remember the secrecy that surrounded the baker's starters, the careful guarding of the fermented cultures that were the heart of each bakery's success. These living treasures were protected like family heirlooms, passed from master baker to trusted apprentice, maintained with religious devotion and scientific precision. A baker whose starter died or became contaminated faced not just financial loss, but professional disgrace, the loss of the invisible partner that made his craft possible. The Roman innovation in bread making went beyond technique to encompass the entire social organization of food production. They created supply chains that could move grain from Egypt and North Africa to bakeries in Rome and Gaul, distribution networks that ensured fresh bread reached markets throughout the empire, quality control systems that maintained standards across thousands of miles and dozens of provinces. The wild yeasts that had once known only Egyptian air learned to work in the cool dampness of British mornings, in the dry heat of Spanish afternoons, in the mountain valleys of the Alps where Roman legions established their camps. Each new environment brought slight changes to the fermentation process. created subtle variations in flavor and texture that reflected local conditions while maintaining the essential character that made the bread recognizably Roman. The empire that conquered through military might sustained itself through daily bread, and that bread carried within its risen structure the accumulated knowledge of Egyptian priests, Greek philosophers, and Roman engineers, the starter cultures that bubbled quietly in bakeries from Hadrian's Wall to the Euphrates River were living libraries of fermentation wisdom, repositories of techniques refined over centuries, partners in the great project of feeding civilization itself. And in the evening, when the last customers had collected their daily bread, and the bakery fires had been banked for the night, the Roman pastors would tend their precious starters one final time, feeding them with fresh flour and clean water, ensuring that tomorrow's bread would carry forward the unbroken chain of fermentation that connected them to every baker who had ever coaxed wild yeasts to transform simple grain into the staff of life. I remember when bread became the foundation upon which all of medieval life was built, when the rhythm of daily existence moved to the sound of grinding grain and the patient bubbling of fermentation. In the centuries that followed Rome's decline, as empires fractured and reformed, as kingdoms rose and fell, bread remained the constant, the unchanging certainty that held communities together when everything else seemed uncertain. By the medieval period, bread had become more than sustenance, was literally the staff of life, providing 3/4 of the calories that sustained ordinary people through their daily labor in the great halls of nobles and the humble cottages of peasants, in the workshops of craftsmen and the cells of monks. The day began with bread and ended with bread, and the quality of that bread often determined the quality of life itself. The wild yeasts that had traveled from the Nile to Athens to Rome had found new homes in the cooler, damper climate of medieval Europe. They had learned to work with different grains, rye and barley and oats, that grew better in northern soil than the wheat that had sustained Mediterranean civilizations. They had adapted to shorter growing seasons, to longer winters, to the particular conditions of a world where survival often depended on making the most of limited resources. I can see the medieval bakeries in my mind's eye, smaller than the great Roman operations, but no less essential to their communities. These were family businesses, passed from father to son, from master to apprentice, carrying with them not just techniques, but traditions, not just recipes, but relationships that bound bakers to their neighbors in networks of mutual dependence and shared responsibility. The guild system that emerged to govern these medieval craftsmen was something entirely new in the history of bread-making, where Roman pastors had been professionals working within the framework of imperial administration. Medieval bakers organized themselves into autonomous associations that wielded real political and economic power. The baker guilds became not just trade organizations, but instruments of social control, regulating not only the quality and price of bread, but the very structure of community life. I remember the weight of responsibility that these guild regulations placed on individual bakers. They were required to produce bread that met strict standards of weight and quality, to sell it at prices fixed by guild authority, to maintain their shops and equipment according to detailed specifications that had been developed over generations of careful practice. A baker who failed to meet these standards faced not just financial penalties, but social disgrace, exclusion from the professional community that defined his identity and livelihood. The guild system also preserved and transmitted the knowledge that made good bread possible. The techniques for maintaining sourdough starters, for judging the proper degree of fermentation, for managing oven temperatures and baking times, all of this wisdom was carefully guarded and systematically passed down from experienced masters to promising apprentices. The wild yeasts that bubbled in medieval starters carried within their microscopic communities the accumulated learning of centuries, the trial and error experimentation of countless bakers who had slowly perfected the art of transforming grain into nourishment. But the medieval world was not simply a continuation of Roman traditions. New challenges required new solutions, and nowhere was this more evident than in the social hierarchy that expressed itself through different types of grain and different qualities of bread. Wheat, the grain that had sustained Mediterranean civilizations, was expensive and difficult to grow in northern climates. It became a luxury, a symbol of wealth and status that most ordinary people could afford only on special occasions. The common people made their daily bread from whatever grains were available, and affordable rye in the Germanic regions, barley in areas where even rye wouldn't grow reliably, oats in the harshest climates where survival meant accepting whatever the soil would provide. These coarser grains produced darker, denser breads with stronger flavors and more complex nutritional profiles, breads that could sustain hard physical labor, but that required different techniques, different understanding, different partnerships with the invisible world of fermentation. It was in working with these alternative grains that medieval bakers discovered something that their Roman predecessors had never fully understood. Sourdough fermentation was not just one way among many to make bread rise, but the best way, sometimes the only way, to work with certain types of flour. Rye, in particular, required the acidic environment that sourdough provided to prevent its starches from breaking down into a gummy, inedible mess. The wild bacteria that worked alongside the yeasts in medieval starters weren't just contributing flavor, they were performing essential chemical transformations that made bread possible. I can see the patient work of medieval bakers as they learned to read the signs that indicated when their living cultures were ready to do their transformative work. The way a properly fermented rye starter would smell not just yeasty, but complex, layered with the sharp tang of lactic acid and the deeper, more mysterious aromas of bacterial fermentation. The way the surface would show a pattern of bubbles that spoke of invisible activity, of microscopic creatures working in harmony to break down complex carbohydrates and create the conditions necessary for good bread. But even as sourdough reached new levels of sophistication in medieval bakeries, it faced its first serious competition from an alternative source of leavening. Beer making had become as important as bread making in medieval communities, and the brewers who converted grain and hops and wild yeasts into ale created, as a byproduct of their work, a frothy, yeasty foam that could be collected and used to make bread rise. This foam, called barm, offered certain advantages over traditional sourdough starters. It worked faster, producing risen dough in hours rather than the days that sourdough required. It was more predictable, less sensitive to temperature and timing variations that could sometimes cause sourdough cultures to fail or produce inconsistent results. And because it was a byproduct of beer production, it was often readily available in communities where ale was brewed regularly for local consumption. I remember the first medieval bakers who experimented with barm, the careful tests they conducted to understand how this new leavening agent compared to their traditional sourdough cultures. They discovered that barm could produce bread that was lighter in texture, milder in flavor, quicker to make than bread leavened with fermented dough. For certain types of wheat bread, especially the fine white loaves that wealthy customers demanded, barm seemed to offer superior results with less effort and less risk. But the adoption of barm was not the simple technological replacement that some historians have suggested. The transition was gradual, uneven, complicated by factors that had as much to do with tradition and preference as with efficiency and convenience. Many bakers continued to use sourdough because they understood its unique properties, because they preferred its complex flavors, because they had invested years in learning to work with their particular starter cultures and were reluctant to abandon techniques that had served them well. More importantly, certain types of bread simply couldn't be made successfully with barm. The rye breads that sustained much of northern Europe required the acidic environment that only sourdough could provide. The coarse, hearty loaves that fed working people needed the slow fermentation that developed complex flavors and improved digestibility. Even wheat breads benefited from sourdough's ability to break down proteins and make nutrients more available to human digestion. The result was a period of coexistence rather than replacement, a time when medieval bakers used both techniques depending on circumstances, customer preferences, and the particular requirements of different types of bread. The guild regulations that governed their work gradually adapted to accommodate both approaches, establishing standards for barm-leavened bread alongside the traditional requirements for sourdough production. I can see the medieval bakeries where both techniques were used side by side, where bakers maintained their precious sourdough starters with the same devotion their predecessors had shown, while also keeping supplies of fresh barm from the local brewery. The wild yeasts and bacteria that had partnered with humanity since that first accident beside the Nile found themselves working alongside cultivated yeasts from a different source, creating breads with different characteristics but the same essential purpose: to transform grain into the daily sustenance that made human civilization possible. The knowledge required to work successfully with both leavening methods was carefully preserved and transmitted through the guild system. Young apprentices learned not just recipes but principles, not just techniques but the underlying science that made fermentation work. They studied the behavior of their living cultures with the same attention that monks devoted to illuminated manuscripts, understanding that they were custodians of knowledge that connected them to countless generations of bakers who had faced the same challenges and discovered the same solutions. In the great monasteries that dotted the medieval landscape, bread-making took on additional significance as both practical necessity and spiritual discipline. The monks who tended their community starters understood that they were participating in a process of transformation that echoed the central mysteries of their faith, the way simple ingredients could be changed into something greater than themselves, the way patience and devotion could produce results that seemed almost miraculous to those who witnessed them without understanding the underlying processes. The wild yeasts that worked in monastic bakeries learned to thrive in environments dedicated to contemplation and prayer, where the rhythm of fermentation harmonized with the rhythm of worship, where bread-making became a form of meditation on the relationships between human effort and divine grace, between the seen and unseen worlds that together created the conditions necessary for life to flourish. And, as evening fell across the medieval landscape, in castle and cottage, In monastery and marketplace, bakers would perform the same rituals their predecessors had followed for centuries, tending their starters, banking their fires, preparing for the next day's work with the same mixture of confidence and humility that comes from understanding one's place in a tradition larger than individual understanding, older than personal memory, more enduring than any single human life. I remember the moment when mystery became science, when the invisible partners that had worked alongside human hands for 5,000 years finally revealed themselves to curious eyes, peering through the lenses of primitive microscopes. It was 1860, in the laboratories of Paris, where Louis Pasteur bent over his instruments and saw for the first time the tiny living creatures that had been transforming grain into bread since that forgotten morning beside the Nile. For 50 centuries, fermentation had been magic. Bakers had learned to work with forces they couldn't see, couldn't understand, couldn't explain except through stories of divine intervention or mysterious natural processes that seemed to operate according to their own invisible laws. They had developed techniques through patient observation and careful experimentation, but always without knowing what they were actually working with, what invisible partners were making their craft possible. The air in Pasteur's laboratory smelled of chemicals and precision, of the antiseptic cleanliness that modern science demanded. Gas lamps flickered over microscope slides where samples of fermenting dough revealed their secrets to eyes that had learned to see what previous generations had only guessed at. The wild yeasts that had remained anonymous for millennia suddenly acquired names, classifications, scientific descriptions that transformed them from mysterious forces into understood biological entities. I can see Pasteur at his work, the methodical patience with which he observed and recorded the behavior of these microscopic creatures. He watched them consume sugars and produce alcohol and carbon dioxide, the same chemical reactions that had been raising bread and making beer since ancient times. But now, for the first time in human history, someone understood the process, could explain it in terms of biological science rather than traditional wisdom or religious mystery. The revelation was profound in ways that went far beyond bread making. Pasteur had discovered that fermentation was the work of living organisms, that the transformation of grain into alcohol or the rising of bread dough was accomplished by creatures so small they were invisible to the naked eye, but so essential that civilization itself depended on their continued partnership with human activity. The practical implications became clear almost immediately. If fermentation was the work of specific microorganisms, then those organisms could be isolated, cultivated, controlled with scientific precision. The unpredictability that had always been part of traditional fermentation, the occasional batches that failed, the starters that mysteriously died, the seasonal variations that affected bread quality, of this could potentially be eliminated through careful management of pure laboratory-cultured yeasts. I remember the excitement that must have filled the first commercial laboratories, where pure baker's yeast was cultivated on an industrial scale. These facilities were temples to the new science of microbiology, sterile environments where specific strains of yeast were grown in carefully controlled conditions, fed with precisely measured nutrients, maintained at optimal temperatures for maximum reproduction and activity. The yeast that emerged from these laboratories was a revelation to commercial bakers who had struggled for generations with the inconsistencies of traditional fermentation. This new product worked faster than sourdough starters, more reliably than more predictably than any leavening agent that had ever existed. It could be shipped across continents without deteriorating, stored for weeks without losing potency, used by bakers who had never learned the complex skills required to maintain living cultures. The transformation of commercial baking happened with startling speed. Within a generation, bakeries that had operated for centuries using traditional methods were converting to the new industrial yeasts. The starter cultures that had been passed from master to apprentice, maintained with religious devotion, treasured as family heirlooms, suddenly seemed primitive, unreliable, unnecessarily complicated. But even as Pasteur's discoveries revolutionized the science of fermentation, another innovation was preparing to transform the entire relationship between bakers and consumers. In the workshops of inventors and tinkerers, mechanical minds were working on problems that had nothing to do with yeast or fermentation, but everything to do with the daily experience of eating bread. Otto Roeder had observed something that seemed obvious once it was pointed out, but that had somehow escaped the attention of centuries of bakers and bread-eaters. Bread was always sliced before it was consumed, and that slicing was always done by hand, with whatever knife was available, producing uneven pieces that varied in thickness depending on the skill and attention of whoever was doing the cutting. I can see Roeder in his workshop, surrounded by gears and blades and mechanical contraptions that seemed to have nothing to do with bread, but that were actually pieces of a puzzle he was trying to solve. How could bread be sliced mechanically, uniformly, efficiently? How could the process be automated in a way that would produce consistent results while preserving the bread's freshness and texture? The first prototype of his bread slicing machine was built in 1912, a complex mechanical device that could slice an entire loaf into uniform pieces in a matter of seconds. But the machine was ahead of its time, a solution to a problem that the bread industry wasn't yet ready to acknowledge. Bakers worried about freshness. Sliced bread would dry out faster than whole loaves. Consumers were suspicious of mechanical processing that seemed to remove the personal touch from something as intimate as daily bread. It took 16 more years before Roeder's invention found its market. In 1928, the Chillicothe Baking Company in Missouri became the first commercial bakery to install one of his machines, and the response was immediate and enthusiastic. Customers loved the convenience of pre-sliced bread, the uniformity of the pieces, the time saved in their daily meal preparation. I remember the rapid transformation that followed. Within 5 years, sliced bread had gone from curiosity to standard, from innovation to necessity. By 1935, 80% of all bread sold in the United States was pre-sliced, wrapped in protective packaging that promised freshness and convenience, but that also created a new distance between consumer and product. The combination of industrial yeast and mechanical slicing created possibilities that had never existed in the long history of bread making. Bread could now be mass-produced in enormous quantities, shipped across great distances, stored on shelves for days or weeks without deteriorating. The local bakery, with its traditional relationships between baker and community, began to seem quaint, inefficient, unnecessarily expensive compared to the modern alternatives. But something was lost in the transformation, something that had been essential to bread making since that first partnership between human hands and wild yeasts. The industrial processes that made bread faster, cheaper, more convenient, also made it more uniform. Less complex, more distant from the natural processes that had originally created it. The wild yeasts that had traveled from Egypt to Greece to Rome to medieval Europe found themselves replaced by their laboratory-bred cousins, standardized strains that worked efficiently but that lacked the complex microbial communities that had given traditional bread its distinctive flavors and nutritional qualities. The slow fermentation that had developed complex flavors and improved digestibility was replaced by rapid industrial processes that prioritized speed and efficiency over taste and tradition. I can see the last generation of traditional bakers, men and women who had learned their craft from parents and grandparents, who had learned it from their own ancestors, watching as their carefully maintained starters became obsolete. Their hard-won skills became unnecessary. Their connection to 5,000 years of bread-making tradition became a liability rather than an asset. The starter cultures that had survived the fall of Rome, the Black Death, countless wars and famines and natural disasters began to disappear, not because they had failed, but because they had become irrelevant. The wild yeasts and bacteria that had partnered with humanity through all the great challenges of civilization found themselves abandoned in favor of newer, more efficient alternatives that could produce bread without requiring the patience, skill, or understanding that traditional fermentation demanded. The gaslight that illuminated Pasteur's laboratory had revealed the secret life of fermentation, but it had also begun the process by which that secret life would be simplified, standardized, commodified. The invisible partners that had made bread possible would continue their work, but under new management, in sterile laboratories rather than traditional bakeries, serving industrial efficiency rather than human community, and yet in quiet corners of the world, in households where tradition mattered more than convenience, in communities where the old ways still held meaning, the ancient starters continued to bubble and rise, maintained by people who understood that some partnerships are too valuable to abandon, some knowledge too precious to lose, some connections between past and present too important to sacrifice on the altar of modern efficiency. The wild yeasts that had survived 5,000 years of human history would not disappear entirely. They would wait patiently for the day when people would remember what had been lost, when the convenience of industrial bread would no longer seem worth the price of forgetting how to work in partnership with the invisible world that makes all transformation possible. I remember the weight of it against a miner's chest, wrapped in leather and wool, kept close to the body through bitter mountain nights, when temperatures dropped below anything a man from the valleys had ever imagined. It wasn't gold they were protecting with such desperate carrot, was something far more precious, far more essential to survival in the wilderness that stretched endlessly beyond the last outpost of civilization. The year was 1849, and the word gold had spread across America like wildfire, drawing men from farms and factories, from counting houses and pulpits, from every corner of a nation that suddenly believed fortune lay waiting in the streams and hillsides of California. They came by the thousands, these fortune-seekers, carrying with them picks and pans, dreams and disappointments. And if they were wise, if they were lucky, if someone had taught them what really mattered, a small portion of living dough, that would mean the difference between survival and starvation in the months ahead. The California Gold Rush created a world where normal rules didn't apply, where the infrastructure of civilization simply didn't exist. There were no bakeries in the mining camps that sprang up along the American River, no mills to grind grain, no reliable supply lines to bring fresh provisions to men who had walked or sailed or fought their way across a continent in pursuit of their dreams. There was only wilderness, harsh and beautiful, and utterly indifferent to human need, and whatever resources a man could carry on his back or pack onto a mule. I can see them in those early camps, men who had never baked bread in their lives, suddenly learning that their survival depended on mastering skills their wives and mothers had taken for granted back home. They learned to tend fires in mountain wind that could extinguish a flame in seconds, to mix dough with hands cracked from cold and hard labor, to judge fermentation by smell and touch when there were no reliable measuring tools, no consistent temperatures, no margin for error. The sourdough starter became their most treasured possession, more valuable than gold dust, more essential than mining equipment. It was life insurance in its most literal form, a guarantee that as long as they had flour and water, as long as they could keep the living culture alive, they could produce food that would sustain them through whatever hardships the wilderness might impose. But keeping a starter alive in the mining camps required knowledge and dedication that went far beyond anything the bakers of settled communities had ever needed to master. The wild yeasts and bacteria that thrived in stable, temperate bakeries faced conditions they had never encountered: extreme cold that could kill them overnight, scorching heat that could destroy their delicate balance, altitude that affected fermentation in ways no one understood, dry mountain air that could desiccate a culture faster than it could be replenished. I remember the techniques that evolved through desperate necessity, the hard-won wisdom passed from miner to miner around campfires where men shared more than warmth and companionship. They learned to sleep with their starters, literally, wrapping the containers in blankets and clothing, using their own body heat to keep the cultures alive through nights when everything else froze solid. They learned to bury the containers in warm ashes, to find sheltered spots near their fires where temperatures stayed relatively constant, to read the signs that told them when their invisible partners were thriving or struggling or dying. The leather pouch became the standard container, practical and portable, something that could be worn against the body during the day and wrapped carefully at night. Inside the pouch, a ceramic or tin container held the precious starter, protected from the elements but accessible for the daily feeding and maintenance that kept it alive. The weight of it became familiar, comforting, a constant reminder that survival was possible as long as the partnership endured. In the Klondike, 49 years later, the conditions were even harsher, the stakes even higher. The gold seekers who climbed the Chilkoot Pass in 1898 faced temperatures that could drop to 40 below zero, winds that could kill a man in minutes, isolation so complete that help might be months away. For these men, sourdough wasn't just convenient, was the difference between life and death. I can see them on the trail, these Klondike stampeders, carrying their starters through snow and ice, protecting their cultures with the same fierce dedication that parents protect their children. They understood, with the clarity that comes only from absolute necessity, that they were carrying more than fermented dough. They were carrying the possibility of bread, the promise of sustenance, the partnership with invisible life that could keep them alive when everything else failed. The nickname came naturally, inevitably. Sourdough became the term for any miner or prospector who had survived a full winter in the Northern Territories, who had proven himself capable of maintaining life, both his own and his starters, in conditions that defeated lesser men, It was a badge of honor, a mark of competence, recognition that surviving in the wilderness required more than courage or strength or luck. It required the patience and skill to work in partnership with living processes that couldn't be hurried or forced or controlled through simple determination. The sourdoughs, the men, not just the starter cultures, developed their own society, their own code, their own understanding of what mattered in a world where comfort and convenience were luxuries no one could afford. They shared their knowledge freely because they understood that everyone's survival depended on everyone else's competence. They helped newcomers learn the skills they needed because they remembered their own early mistakes and the men who had saved their lives by teaching them better methods. I remember the stories they told around their fires, stories of starters that had survived impossible journeys, that had been rescued from frozen tents and flooded claims, that had been shared and divided and passed along like living inheritance. There was the starter that supposedly came across the plains with the Oregon Trail pioneers, that had been maintained through Indian attacks and river crossings and every hardship the westward migration could impose. There was the culture that claimed descent from Russian Alaska, from the fur traders who had worked these lands before gold was discovered, that carried within its microbial community the memory of an even earlier partnership between human need and wild nature. Whether these stories were true mattered less than what they represented, the understanding that sourdough starters were living links to the past, connections to other times and places where people had faced similar challenges and found similar solutions. The wild yeasts that bubbled in mining camp containers were the same species that had risen in Egyptian ovens, that had leavened Roman bread, that had sustained medieval communities through plague and famine and war. They carried within their invisible communities the accumulated wisdom of 5,000 years of partnership with human civilization. The mining camps developed their own culture around bread making, their own traditions and techniques adapted to the unique challenges of wilderness life. They learned to bake in Dutch ovens buried in coals, to create makeshift ovens from stones and clay, to judge doneness by smell and sound when there were no reliable ways to measure temperature or time. They experimented with local ingredients, berries and nuts that grew wild in the mountains, honey from bee trees, game fat that could enrich their simple loaves with precious calories and protein. But perhaps most importantly, they learned to share. In a world where individual survival depended on community cooperation, where a man's failure could endanger everyone in his camp, the sourdough starter became a symbol of mutual dependence and mutual responsibility. When a miner's culture died, others would share portions of their own. When someone struck it rich and headed back to civilization, he would leave his starter with someone who was staying, ensuring that the partnership would continue, that the knowledge would be preserved, that the next group of greenhorns would have access to the wisdom that could keep them alive. I can see them at their work, these rough men in a harsh land, handling their living cultures with a gentleness that might have surprised their families back home. The careful feeding, the patient waiting, the attention to detail that fermentation required, all of this created moments of quiet contemplation in lives otherwise dominated by backbreaking, labor, and constant danger. The daily ritual of tending the starter became a form of meditation, a connection to something larger and more enduring than the immediate struggle for survival or wealth. The sourdough bread that emerged from mining camp ovens was unlike anything produced in settled communities. It was denser, more substantial, designed to provide maximum nutrition and energy for men performing the hardest physical labor imaginable. It had complex flavors developed through long, slow fermentation in the variable temperatures of wilderness conditions. It kept well in dry mountain air, traveled without deteriorating, satisfied hunger in ways that quick breads or hardtack never could. But more than its practical qualities, the bread represented something essential to human survival in hostile environments, proof that civilization could be carried in a leather pouch, that the partnership between human skill and natural processes was portable, adaptable, enduring. The men who ate that bread understood that they were consuming more than calories and carbohydrates. They were participating in a tradition that connected them to every human community that had ever sustained itself through patient cooperation with the invisible world. The wild yeasts that worked in those mining camp starters faced evolutionary pressures they had never encountered before. They learned to function at high altitude in extreme temperature variations, with irregular feeding schedules and unfamiliar flour types. They adapted to work with whatever grains were available: wheat when it could be obtained, corn when it couldn't, barley or oats, or whatever else could be ground into flour. They developed resilience, flexibility, the ability to survive conditions that would have killed their pampered cousins in civilized bakeries. Some of those hardy cultures survived the gold rush years, were carried back to civilization by miners who had learned to value them more highly than precious metals. They found new homes in settled communities, in bakeries where their wilderness-tested toughness made them especially valuable for maintaining consistent fermentation even under less than perfect conditions. The starter that had learned to survive, Klondike winters could handle the minor temperature variations of a commercial bakery with ease. San Francisco became the ultimate destination for many of these survivor cultures. The city where gold rush fortunes were spent and gold rush stories were told, where the sourdough tradition took root in ways that would influence bread making for generations to come. The wild yeasts that had traveled from mining camps to the cosmopolitan city by the bay found conditions that were different but not entirely unfamiliar, the cool, foggy climate that seemed almost designed for the slow fermentation they had perfected in mountain camps. I remember the satisfaction that must have filled those early sourdough bakers, men who had learned their craft not in traditional apprenticeships but through necessity, through trial and error, through the kind of education that comes only from understanding that failure means starvation. They had mastered skills that connected them to the most ancient traditions of human civilization, had proven that the partnership between human hands and wild nature could survive and flourish even under the most challenging conditions. As evening fell across the mining camps and the Klondike settlements, as fires were banked and starters were wrapped and protected for another night, the men who had earned the name sourdough could rest with the knowledge that they had not simply survived another day, but had maintained something precious, something essential, something that connected them to the long chain of human communities that had sustained themselves through patience, skill, and respect for the invisible forces that make life possible. The thread that began beside the Nile had traveled to the farthest corners of the American wilderness, carried by men who understood that true wealth was not the gold they sought, but the living cultures they protected, not the fortunes they might make, but the partnerships they maintained, not the individual success they pursued, but the community knowledge they shared and preserved and passed along to those who would follow in their footsteps. And in the leather pouches worn close to miners' hearts, the ancient yeasts continued their patient work, transforming simple ingredients into daily miracles, proving once again that some things are too valuable to abandon, too essential to lose, too important to sacrifice for any amount of gold that might glitter in a prospector's pan. I remember the fog rolling in from the Pacific, thick and grey, and carrying with it the salt taste of distant oceans, settling over the hills of San Francisco like a blanket that muffled sound, and softened the edges of a city that was still rough around the corners, still finding its identity in the aftermath of gold rush fever. It was 1849, and the harbor was crowded with ships from every corner of the world, their masts creating a forest of wood and rope against the morning sky, their holds emptying passengers who carried with them dreams and desperation in equal measure. Among those passengers, stepping onto the wooden docks with the careful gait of a man who had spent too many weeks at sea, was Isidore Boudin, a baker from the Burgundy region of France, who had come to California not for gold, but for something he understood far better than opportunity to feed people who were hungry for the bread of home. Boudin carried with him more than the usual immigrant's bundle of possessions. Wrapped carefully in his traveling pack, protected from salt air and rough handling, was a portion of fermented dough that represented generations of French baking traditions, wild yeasts and bacteria that had learned to work with French flour, French climate, French hands. The San Francisco that greeted him was unlike anything he had ever experienced. The climate was strange cool and foggy in summer, mild in winter, with temperature variations that seemed to follow no pattern he recognized from European seasons. The fog that rolled in from the ocean created humidity levels that changed by the hour. I can see him in those first weeks, setting up his bakery on DuPont Street in what would later become Chinatown, learning to work with unfamiliar conditions, unfamiliar customers, unfamiliar challenges that tested everything he thought he knew about his craft. The starter he had brought from France behaved differently in San Francisco, air sometimes rising more quickly than expected, sometimes developing flavors he had never tasted before, sometimes struggling to maintain the consistent activity that had made it reliable in the controlled environment of his homeland bakery. But Boudin was not the only baker trying to establish himself in the booming city. French immigrants had been arriving steadily since the gold rush began, and many of them brought with them the same traditions, the same techniques, the same living cultures that had sustained their families for generations. What none of them understood, what no one could have understood in 1849, was that their starters were undergoing a transformation as significant as any that had occurred since that first accidental fermentation beside the Nile. The wild yeasts of San Francisco Bay were settling into the carefully maintained cultures, finding new homes alongside the European microorganisms, creating hybrid communities that would produce flavors unlike anything that had ever existed before. The fog became part of the story, though it would be more than a century before anyone understood why. The cool, moist air that rolled in from the Pacific created perfect conditions for certain types of wild yeasts, microorganisms that thrived in the specific temperature and humidity ranges that San Francisco fog provided. I remember the gradual realization that must have dawned on Boudin and his fellow bakers as months turned to years, and their bread developed characteristics they had never encountered before. The tang was sharper, more pronounced than anything they had produced in France. The customers noticed, too, the miners who came to San Francisco to spend their gold, the merchants who supplied the mining camps, the sailors and immigrants and adventurers who made the city their temporary or permanent home, they all began to ask specifically for San Francisco bread. The mythology began almost immediately. San Francisco bakers started claiming that their bread was special because of the local climate, because of something in the air or the water or the geography that made fermentation work differently here than anywhere else. Boudin's bakery became one of the most successful, not because his starter was more authentic than others, but because he was among the first to embrace the changes that San Francisco conditions were producing in his fermentation cultures. I can see the daily routine that developed in his bakery, the rhythm that connected French tradition with California innovation. The starter was fed each morning with local flour, flour milled from wheat that had grown in California soil under California sun, processed by mills that operated according to California efficiency rather than European custom. The water came from local wells, carrying with it the mineral content of Bay Area geology, contributing its own subtle influences to the fermentation process. The ovens were built according to French specifications, but adapted to local materials and local needs. But it was the starter that told the real story, the living culture that was slowly becoming something that had never existed before. The French yeasts that Boudin had carried across an ocean were learning to work with San Francisco wild yeasts that had never known wheat flour, never participated in bread making. The bread that emerged from this partnership was unlike anything produced anywhere else in the world. It had the complex flavor development that came from slow, traditional fermentation, but with distinctive sour notes that reflected the unique bacterial communities that thrived in San Francisco's climate. Word spread beyond the city, carried by travelers who remembered the taste long after they had left San Francisco behind. The sourdough bread of the Bay City became famous throughout California, then throughout the West, then eventually throughout America as something distinctively Californian, uniquely San Franciscan. The bakers themselves began to believe their own mythology. They spoke of their starters as if they were precious heirlooms that could only survive in San Francisco air, as if the partnership between human skill and wild fermentation required the specific conditions that only their city could provide. I remember the stories that developed around the most successful bakeries, tales that transformed practical business success into romantic legends. Boudin's bakery, in particular, became the subject of stories that emphasized the mystical connection between place and product, that suggested the bread could only be authentic if it were made in the exact location where the tradition had first taken root. The truth was both simpler and more complex than the legends suggested. The San Francisco sourdough tradition was indeed unique, but not because of any mystical properties of the local geography. It was unique because it represented a successful marriage between European expertise and American conditions, between traditional techniques and innovative adaptation. But the mythology was more powerful than the scientific reality, and it served purposes that went beyond mere marketing. In a city that was still defining its identity, that was still deciding what it meant to be San Franciscan rather than merely Californian or American. The sourdough tradition provided a sense of place, a connection to something distinctive and valuable. The bakers who maintained the city's sourdough cultures understood that they were custodians of more than living fermentation. They were guardians of civic identity, keepers of traditions that made San Francisco different from every other American city. Their starters carried within their microscopic communities not just the capacity to make bread rise, but the power to transform flour and water into something that tasted like home. And as the fog rolled in each evening, carrying with it the wild yeasts that would continue to colonize and influence the carefully maintained cultures in bakeries throughout the city, the partnership between human tradition and local conditions continued to evolve, continued to create flavors that belonged specifically to this place. This time, the thread that connected San Francisco sourdough to that first fermentation beside the Nile had grown more complex, more interesting, more uniquely adapted to its new environment. But it remained unbroken, still carrying within it the essential partnership between human skill and wild nature that had made bread possible for 5,000 years, still proving that the best traditions are not preserved by keeping them exactly the same, but by allowing them to grow and change and adapt while maintaining their essential character, their fundamental commitment to the patient work of transformation that connects us to something larger and more enduring than our individual lives. This particular marriage between European knowledge and American innovation, this specific community of microorganisms that had developed in San Francisco bakeries, the traditions that had grown up around their cultivation and use, created something that was both ancient and entirely new. The fog continued to roll in from the Pacific, carrying with it the promise that this living tradition would continue to evolve, would continue to adapt, would continue to connect the people of San Francisco to the ancient art of transforming grain into sustenance, into community, into the taste of home, wherever they might find themselves in the world. I remember the silence that came before the shaking, the way the morning held its breath in the moments before 5:12 on April 18th, 1906. San Francisco was still sleeping, the fog still clinging to the hills like a familiar blanket, when the earth beneath the city began to move in ways that no human architecture had been designed to withstand. The first tremor lasted less than a minute, but it was enough to crack the foundations of a civilization that had grown comfortable in its assumptions about permanence, about the reliability of solid ground, about the security of buildings and businesses, and all the careful arrangements that made urban life possible. In the Boudin bakery on DuPont Street, the ovens that had been heating for the morning's first batch of bread suddenly became weapons, their brick-and-mortar construction no match for forces that could reshape the very landscape. But the earthquake, devastating as it was, would prove to be only the beginning, in the broken gas lines and overturned stoves, in the chaos of a city whose fire department had lost water pressure, in the panic that follows when familiar landmarks become unrecognizable. The real destroyer was already stirring to life. I can see Louise Boudin in those first chaotic hours, the wife of the baker who had established the family business 57 years earlier, watching from the street as flames crept closer to everything she and her husband had built. The earthquake had damaged the bakery, but not destroyed. If the ovens were cracked, the walls were twisted, but the building still stood, still contained within it the tools and equipment, and most precious of all, the starter culture that represented more than half a century of careful maintenance, of daily feeding, of patient partnership with the invisible life that made their bread possible. The mother dough, as she called it, was housed in a large ceramic crock that had become as much a part of the bakery's identity as the ovens themselves. For 57 years, since Isidore Boudin had first established his business in the aftermath of the gold rush, that living culture had been fed and tended and maintained through every challenge the city had faced. The fire was moving systematically through the city, consuming entire blocks with an efficiency that seemed almost purposeful. The firefighters, hampered by broken water mains and equipment damaged in the earthquake, could do little more than try to create 50 breaks, to sacrifice some buildings in hopes of saving others. I remember the moment when Louise Boudin understood that her choice was not whether to save the bakery. The fire would make that decision for her, but what to save from the bakery before it was too late to save anything at all. The ceramic crock was heavy, awkward to carry, filled with enough fermented dough to maintain the culture through whatever difficulties lay ahead. But Louise Boudin was a baker's wife, a woman who understood that some things are worth any effort required to preserve them. As the flames grew closer and the heat became unbearable, she wrapped her arms around the crock and carried it out into the street, joining the thousands of other refugees who were fleeing with whatever they had managed to save from lives that were disappearing behind them in smoke and flame. The parallel to the gold rush miners was exact, though Louise Boudin may not have realized it in that moment of desperate action. Like the sourdoughs who had carried their starters against their bodies through Klondike winters, she was protecting a living treasure that was more valuable than any material possession. I can see her in the refugee camps that sprang up in Golden Gate Park and the Presidio, surrounded by the displaced population of an entire city, still tending her precious culture as if she were in her own familiar bakery. The daily feeding continued, the careful attention to temperature and consistency, the patient work of maintaining life in the midst of destruction. Around her, people mourned for possessions they had lost, for businesses destroyed, for neighborhoods that existed now only in memory. The fire burned for 3 days, consuming everything in its path with such thoroughness that survivors described whole districts as simply vanishing, as if they had never existed. The business district was gone, Chinatown was gone, most of the residential neighborhoods south of Market Street were gone. The Boudin bakery, like thousands of other businesses, was reduced to rubble and ash, its ovens cracked and blackened, its equipment melted or broken beyond repair. But in the refugee camp, in a makeshift shelter built from salvaged boards and canvas, the mother dough continued to bubble and rise. The rebuilding began almost immediately, driven by the same restless energy that had built the city in the first place. Insurance companies paid claims, investors provided capital, workers cleared rubble and laid new foundations with remarkable speed. Most of the city's bakeries had lost their starters in the fire, along with everything else they had built over decades of careful work. The wild yeasts and bacteria that had adapted to San Francisco conditions, that had learned to work with local flour and local hands, that had developed the complex microbial communities that produced distinctive flavors, all of this invisible heritage was gone. But Louise Boudin's heroic rescue of the mother dough meant that at least one thread of continuity survived, one unbroken connection to the traditions that had made San Francisco sourdough famous throughout the American West. When the new Boudin bakery opened its doors, when the reconstructed ovens began producing bread again, the living culture that fermented the dough was the same culture that had been working in San Francisco bakeries since 1849. I remember the transformation of this practical act into founding legend. The way Louise Boudin's desperate decision to save her starter became, over time, the heroic origin story of an entire tradition. The ceramic crock became a sacred relic. The refugee camp feeding became an act of devotion that went far beyond mere business necessity. The story grew in the telling, as such stories always do. Details were added, emphasis was shifted. The mundane realities of maintaining a sourdough culture under difficult conditions were transformed into mythic actions that seemed to transcend ordinary human capability. The marketing power of the story was undeniable. In the years that followed, Boudin Bakery could claim not just continuity but authenticity, not just tradition but legend. Their bread was made with the same starter that had survived the great disaster, the same living culture that had been heroically preserved when everything else was lost. But the deeper truth was more complex and perhaps more interesting than the simplified legend suggested. Louise Boudin had indeed saved her starter, had indeed maintained it through the chaos and displacement that followed the fire. But she had not been the only person to make such an effort. Some had succeeded, some had failed, some had partially succeeded, only to lose their cultures later to contamination, or neglect, or simple exhaustion. The Boudin story became famous not because it was unique, but because it was documented, celebrated, transformed into marketing material that served the practical purpose of distinguishing one bakery from its competitors. I remember the wild yeasts themselves, the microscopic survivors who had no understanding of heroism or legend or marketing strategy. They had simply continued their ancient work of fermentation, transforming sugars into acids and alcohol and carbon dioxide, maintaining the chemical processes that made bread possible. The ceramic crock that protected them during those 3 days of refugee camp life was just another container, no different in their experience from the dozens of vessels they had occupied over the decades of their partnership with human hands. The new bakery that housed them when normal operations resumed was unfamiliar at first, built with different materials, arranged according to a different floor plan, operated by workers who had to relearn their craft in unfamiliar surroundings. But the essential processes remained the same: the daily feeding, the careful maintenance of temperature and consistency, the patient waiting for fermentation to complete its invisible work. The bread that emerged from the reconstructed ovens tasted the same as the bread that had made the Boudin name famous before the fire. The wild yeasts had not been traumatized by their experience, had not lost their capacity to work in partnership with human skill. The thread that connected San Francisco sourdough to 5,000 years of human fermentation tradition had survived its greatest challenge, preserved by a woman who understood that her responsibility was not just to her own family's business, but to something larger and more essential. The wild yeasts that had traveled from the Nile to San Francisco Bay continued their patient work, carrying within their invisible communities the memory of every baker who had ever tended them, the wisdom of every hand that had ever shaped their fermented dough into daily bread. I remember when the invisible became visible, when the patient work of microscopes and Petri dishes finally revealed the secret. Society that had been operating in every sourdough starter since that first forgotten bowl beside the Nile for 5,000 years. Bakers had worked in partnership with creatures they could not see, could not count, could not name, understanding their effects but not their nature, their preferences but not their biology, their essential role but not their actual identity. The revelation came slowly, piece by piece, as 20th century microbiologists turned their attention to fermentation systems that had been taken for granted for millennia. In sterile laboratories far removed from the warmth and chaos of working bakeries, researchers began the patient work of isolation and identification, of counting and categorizing the microscopic inhabitants of living cultures, that home bakers fed with casual confidence and commercial operations maintained with industrial precision. What they discovered was an ecosystem as complex and interdependent as any tropical rainforest, as carefully balanced as any coral reef, as essential to human civilization as any agricultural system. The simple mixture of flour and water that bubbled quietly on kitchen counters throughout the world was home to dozens of species, hundreds of strains, countless individual organisms working in partnerships so intricate that no human management system had ever achieved such elegant efficiency. I can see those early researchers, men and women trained to think in terms of pure cultures and controlled variables, struggling to understand fermentation, communities that defied every assumption about microbial behavior. They were accustomed to studying single species in isolation, to understanding bacterial and yeast activity as separate phenomena that could be analyzed independently and combined predictably. But sourdough starters refused to cooperate with such reductionist approaches. The first surprise was numerical. When the microbiologists began counting the inhabitants of active starters, they discovered that bacteria outnumbered yeasts by ratios that seemed almost impossible. For every single yeast cell floating in the fermented dough, there were 100 bacterial cells, sometimes more. The yeasts that bakers had always assumed were the primary agents of fermentation, the creatures responsible for making bread rise, were actually a small minority in their own supposed domain. The bacteria, it turned out, were not passive passengers or accidental contaminants, as some researchers had initially theorized. They were active, essential participants in every aspect of the fermentation process, contributing not just to flavor development, but to the fundamental chemistry that made sourdough possible. The lactic acid bacterial Lactobacillus species that had learned to thrive in the specific environment that flour and water created were the true engineers of sourdough fermentation. I remember the gradual understanding that emerged as researchers mapped the intricate relationships between these bacterial and yeast populations. The lactic acid bacteria consume the complex carbohydrates in flour, breaking them down into simpler sugars that the yeasts could metabolize. In return, the yeasts produced compounds that created favorable growing conditions for the bacteria, adjusting pH levels and creating chemical environments that supported bacterial reproduction and activity. But the bacteria did far more than simply prepare food for their yeast partners. They produced the acids that gave sourdough its characteristic tanglactic acid and acetic acid in carefully balanced proportions that varied depending on temperature, hydration, feeding schedule, and the particular strains of bacteria present in each individual starter. These acids served multiple functions. They created the flavor profiles that distinguished sourdough bread from other fermented products. They preserved the starter by creating an environment hostile to harmful microorganisms, and they modified the grain proteins in ways that improved both the nutritional value and digestibility of the finished bread. The preservation function was particularly important, though it had been understood only intuitively by traditional bakers. The acidic environment that lactic acid bacteria created was lethal to most pathogenic organisms, effectively sterilizing the starter culture and ensuring that dangerous bacteria could not establish themselves in the fermentation community. This natural preservation system had been protecting human food supplies for millennia without anyone understanding the mechanisms involved. I can see the excitement that must have filled research laboratories as scientists began to understand the elegant complexity of these relationships. The sourdough starter that grandmothers maintained with simple flour and water contained sophisticated chemical processes that rivaled anything achieved in modern industrial facilities. The bacterial communities were producing natural antibiotics, pH buffers, flavor compounds, and protein-modifying enzymes with a precision that no human manufacturing system could duplicate. The yeast populations were equally complex and surprising, rather than the single species that most bakers assumed they were working with. Active starters typically contained multiple yeast strains, each adapted to specific phases of the fermentation cycle, each contributing different capabilities to the overall process. Kazakhstania humilis, often the dominant species, specialized in metabolizing the particular sugars found in wheat, flour, and producing the carbon dioxide that made bread rise. Saccharomyces cerevisiae, the same species used in beer and wine production, contributed to flavor development and alcohol production, creating compounds that enhanced the complexity of the finished bread. But perhaps most importantly, the researchers discovered that the composition of these microbial communities was not fixed or predetermined, but dynamic, constantly changing in response to environmental conditions, feeding schedules, flour types, and handling techniques. The baker, it turned out, was not simply maintaining a static culture, but conducting a living orchestra, influencing the balance between different species through every decision about temperature, timing, hydration, and nutrition. I remember the realization that traditional baking wisdom, passed down through generations of practical experience, had been unconsciously optimizing these microbial relationships without any understanding of the underlying biology. When experienced bakers talked about reading their starters, about knowing when the fermentation was ready by smell and appearance and behavior, they were actually monitoring complex biochemical processes with remarkable accuracy and sensitivity. The temperature preferences that different bakers had discovered through trial and error corresponded exactly to the optimal growth conditions for different bacterial and yeast species. Cooler fermentation favored bacteria that produced more acetic acid, creating sharper, more vinegar-like flavors. Warmer conditions promoted lactic acid production, resulting in milder, more yogurt-like sourness. The hydration levels that produced different bread textures were actually controlling the balance between aerobic and anaerobic metabolism in the starter community. Even the flour choices that affected flavor and performance could now be understood in microbiological terms. Different grain varieties contained different types and concentrations of nutrients, supporting different microbial populations and producing different fermentation products. Whole grain flours, with their higher levels of minerals and enzymes, created more complex bacterial communities and more rapid fermentation. Refined flours produced more predictable results, but less complex flavor development. I can see the implications of this knowledge spreading slowly through the baking community, transforming understanding even as it validated traditional practices. Home bakers who had always fed their starters by instinct could now understand why their techniques worked. Commercial bakeries could optimize their cultures with scientific precision rather than relying entirely on inherited wisdom and accumulated experience. But the research also revealed how much traditional bakers had achieved without any formal understanding of what they were working with. The starter cultures that had been maintained for generations, passed from baker to baker like living heirlooms, were masterpieces of applied microbiology. They represented evolutionary processes that had selected for the most beneficial bacterial and yeast strains, creating fermentation communities perfectly adapted to their specific environments and uses. The wild yeasts that had first colonized that forgotten bowl beside the Nile had indeed been transformed by their partnership with human hands, but not in the way anyone had imagined. They had not been domesticated in the way that plants and animals had been domesticated. Instead, they had formed complex ecological relationships with bacteria, creating interdependent communities that could survive and thrive in environments that neither yeasts nor bacteria could successfully inhabit alone. I remember the surprise that researchers felt when they realized that the most stable, most productive starter cultures were also the most diverse, containing not just 2 or 3 species, but entire ecosystems of microorganisms working in carefully balanced relationships. The monocultures that industrial food production favored were actually less resilient, less adaptable, less capable of producing the complex flavors and textures that made traditional sourdough distinctive. This discovery challenged fundamental assumptions about efficiency and control in food production. The industrial model that had dominated commercial baking since Pasteur's time was based on the idea that simpler was better, that pure cultures were more reliable than mixed populations, that human control was preferable to natural variation. But sourdough starters demonstrated that complexity could be more stable than simplicity, that diversity could be more predictable than uniformity, that partnership could be more effective than control. The bacterial communities that dominated every healthy starter were performing functions that no single species could achieve alone. They were creating chemical environments, producing nutrients, breaking down toxins, competing with harmful organisms, and modifying grain proteins through collaborative processes that had evolved over millions of years of natural selection. Human bakers had not created these communities, but had learned to work with them to provide the conditions they needed to thrive, to harvest the benefits of their invisible labor. The wild yeasts contributed their own essential capabilities, primarily the production of carbon dioxide that made bread rise, but also enzymes that broke down starches, alcohols that contributed to flavor development, and chemical compounds that enhanced the keeping quality of the finished bread. But they could not create the acidic environment they needed for protection, could not break down the complex carbohydrates they required for nutrition, could not survive the temperature and pH variations that sourdough fermentation involved without their bacterial partners. I remember the elegant symmetry that emerged as researchers mapped these relationships in greater detail. The bacteria created the conditions that yeasts needed to survive and thrive. The yeasts produced the compounds that bacteria required for their own growth and reproduction. Together, they created fermentation products that neither could produce alone, transformed raw flour into complex nutritional systems that supported human health in ways that simple grain consumption could never achieve. The acids they produced together made minerals more available for human absorption. The enzymes they created broke down proteins in ways that improved digestibility and reduced the potential for allergic reactions. The fermentation process itself pre-digested complex carbohydrates, making the energy in grain more accessible to human metabolism while reducing the glycemic impact of bread consumption. But perhaps most remarkably, the starter communities were self-regulating, maintaining their own internal balance without requiring constant human intervention. When feeding schedules changed, the microbial populations adjusted. When temperatures fluctuated, different species became temporarily dominant until conditions stabilized. When contaminating organisms attempted to establish themselves, the established community typically outcompeted them and restored the previous balance. This resilience explained how starter cultures had survived for generations under conditions that would have killed pure laboratory cultures in hours. The diversity that made them complex also made them stable. The redundancy that seemed inefficient also made them adaptable. The partnerships that appeared chaotic also made them capable of responding to challenges that no single species could overcome alone. And in kitchens around the world, in homes and bakeries, where people continued the ancient practice of feeding their starters with flour and water, the invisible communities continued their patient work, transforming simple ingredients into complex ecosystems, proving that the most sophisticated technologies are often the ones that have learned to work in partnership with natural processes rather than against them, the ones that enhance biological systems rather than replacing them, the ones that recognize complexity as a source of strength rather than a problem to be solved. I remember when bread became rebellion, when the simple act of feeding flour and water to a living culture became a statement against everything that industrial food production had come to represent. It was the late 1990s, and across America, in small bakeries and home kitchens, people were rediscovering skills that had been nearly lost to the efficiency of mass production, returning to practices that connected them to something older and more essential than the wrapped loaves that filled supermarket shelves. The artisan baking movement began quietly, almost apologetically, in neighborhoods where people still remembered what bread used to taste like, before it became a commodity manufactured in factories and shipped in trucks. These were places where someone's grandmother still maintained a sourdough starter, where local bakeries had somehow survived the economic pressures that had driven most traditional bread makers out of business, where the memory of real fermentation lingered despite decades of industrial optimization. The pioneers of this renaissance were not professional bakers trained in culinary schools, but passionate amateurs who had become dissatisfied with the uniformity and blandness of commercial bread. They were home cooks who wanted to understand their food, who craved the satisfaction of creating something with their own hands, who sensed that something important had been lost in the pursuit of convenience and consistency. I can see them in their kitchens, these early artisan bakers, surrounded by books that had been out of print for decades, trying to decipher traditional techniques that had once been common knowledge, but now seemed as mysterious as ancient crafts. They were attempting to recreate not just recipes, but entire systems of understanding, ways of working with living processes that industrial baking had systematically eliminated, in favor of chemical leavening and mechanical mixing. The wild yeasts that had been displaced by commercial bakers' yeast found new homes in these experimental kitchens. carried in starter cultures that were often gifts from friends or relatives who had maintained family traditions. Through the lean decades of industrial dominance, each new culture was a small act of archaeological recovery, a resurrection of fermentation communities that represented generations of accumulated wisdom about working with invisible life. The learning curve was steep and sometimes discouraging. Home bakers accustomed to the reliability of commercial yeast found themselves struggling with fermentation that seemed unpredictable, with timing that varied according to temperature and season, with flavors that changed subtly from batch to batch in ways that mass-produced bread never did. The living cultures demanded attention, patience, understanding qualities that modern life seemed designed to eliminate. But gradually, as these amateur bakers learned to read the signs that indicated healthy fermentation, to adjust their techniques according to the needs of their particular starters, to work in partnership rather than trying to control processes that had their own natural rhythms, they began producing bread that surpassed anything available in stores. The flavors were more complex, the textures more interesting, the satisfaction of creation more rewarding than anything that money could purchase. I remember the small bakeries that began opening in urban neighborhoods, enterprises founded by people who had discovered sourdough baking as a hobby and gradually realized that they were part of something larger than personal interest. These were not businesses created by market research or financial calculation, but by passion for craft, by commitment to quality that went beyond profit margins, by understanding that some things are too valuable to be produced solely for economic efficiency. The customers who discovered these artisan bakeries were hungry for more than bread. They were seeking connection to processes that felt authentic in a world increasingly dominated by artificial ingredients and industrial methods. They wanted to support businesses that reflected their values, that treated food as culture rather than commodity, that maintained relationships with their communities rather than pursuing unlimited expansion. The artisan bakers learned to tell the stories of their bread, not just the recipes and techniques, but the history and tradition, the sources of their ingredients, the particular characteristics of their starter cultures. They understood intuitively what industrial food production had forgotten, that people want to know where their food comes from, how it is made, who made it, what traditions and values shaped its creation. The wild yeasts and bacteria that worked in artisan bakeries began to develop their own local characteristics, influenced by the particular flour being used, the specific climate conditions, the individual techniques of each baker. The standardization that industrial production demanded was replaced by variation that reflected place and person, by flavors that could not be duplicated elsewhere, because they emerged from unique combinations of environment and expertise. But the artisan movement remained relatively small, confined to urban neighborhoods where customers were willing to pay premium prices for handcrafted bread, limited by the time and skill required to maintain traditional fermentation methods. The wild yeasts that had found new homes in these specialized bakeries served relatively few people compared to the millions who continued to consume mass-produced bread made with commercial yeast and chemical preservatives. Then came March of 2020, and everything changed with a speed that no one could have anticipated. The pandemic lockdowns that swept across the world created conditions that nobody had planned for, but that proved perfect for the resurrection of home baking traditions. Suddenly, Millions of people were confined to their homes with time they had never expected to have, with restaurants and bakeries closed or severely limited, with supply chains disrupted in ways that made simple ingredients seem precious rather than taken for granted. I can see those first desperate trips to grocery stores where the yeast shelves were empty, where flour had become as scarce as any luxury item, where people who had never baked bread in their lives were suddenly motivated by necessity or boredom or the simple desire to create something nourishing with their own hands. The commercial yeast that had dominated home baking for nearly a century was suddenly unavailable, forcing people to consider alternatives they had never explored. The sourdough starter, that ancient technology that required nothing but flour and water and time, became the solution to a modern problem. Social media filled with images of bubbling cultures, with questions about fermentation timing, with photos of loaves that represented not just sustenance but achievement, creativity, connection to something timeless in a moment when everything felt uncertain and temporary. The wild yeasts that had been waiting patiently in maintained cultures, in family traditions, in artisan bakeries, suddenly found themselves in demand by millions of new partners. Established bakers began sharing their starters like gifts, mailing portions of living cultures to friends and strangers, creating networks of fermentation that connected people across distances that physical separation had made unbridgeable. I remember the learning process that unfolded in homes around the world as people who had never maintained living cultures discovered what traditional bakers had always known, that fermentation requires patience, attention, willingness to work with natural processes that follow their own rhythms rather than human schedules. The failures were frequent and sometimes spectacular, but they were also educational in ways that commercial yeast had never required. The online communities that formed around sourdough baking became virtual apprenticeship systems, places where experienced bakers shared knowledge with beginners, where questions were answered with the generosity that comes from understanding that everyone benefits when traditional skills are preserved and transmitted. The isolated individuals that pandemic restrictions had created found connection through shared commitment to ancient practices. The bread that emerged from these home ovens was unlike anything most people had ever tasted. The slow fermentation that sourdough required produced flavors that were more complex than anything achievable with commercial yeast, textures that varied according to the particular characteristics of each starter, keeping qualities that meant bread stayed fresh longer without chemical preservatives. But perhaps more importantly, the process of making sourdough bread provided something that modern life had systematically eliminated: daily ritual, patient waiting, attention to living processes that could not be hurried or controlled through technology. The feeding of starters became meditation. The shaping of loaves became craft. The baking became a form of creation that connected people to generations of human experience. I can see the transformation in kitchens around the world as people who had never considered themselves bakers discovered that they were capable of producing food that nourished not just the body but the spirit. The wild yeasts that bubbled in improvised containers were the same species that had worked with human hands for millennia, but they were creating new partnerships with people who had been disconnected from traditional food production. The children who watched their parents feed starters and shape loaves were learning skills that their grandparents had taken for granted, but that had nearly disappeared from modern life. They were witnessing the patient work of fermentation, the daily commitment that living cultures require, the satisfaction that comes from creating something essential rather than simply consuming what others have produced. The commercial bakeries that had survived the artisan movement's early years found themselves overwhelmed with demand from customers who had discovered through home baking what real bread could taste like. The mass-produced loaves that had dominated grocery shelves for decades suddenly seemed insufficient. Bland, disconnected from the living processes that people had learned to appreciate during their enforced time at home. The wild yeasts that had never disappeared, that had waited through the industrial centuries in maintained cultures and specialty bakeries, in home kitchens and artisan shops, suddenly found themselves partners in a renaissance that reached into millions of homes. The partnership between human hands and invisible life that had sustained civilization for 5,000 years was being rediscovered by people who had thought such knowledge was irrelevant to modern life. I remember the networks that formed as people began sharing not just their bread, but their starters, their knowledge, their commitment to maintaining living cultures that connected them to something larger than individual experience. The portion of fermented dough that someone received from a friend or stranger carried with it not just the capacity to make bread, but membership in a community that transcended geographical boundaries, cultural differences, economic distinctions. The starter cultures that traveled through mail systems and social networks were living libraries of fermentation, wisdom, repositories of techniques that had been refined over generations, carriers of flavors that reflected the particular conditions where they had developed. Each new home they entered became part of their history. Each new baker who learned to work with them became a custodian of traditions that had survived every challenge that human civilization had faced. And as the acute phase of the pandemic passed, as restrictions lifted and normal life resumed, many of the people who had discovered sourdough baking continued their practice. The daily feeding became habit. The weekly baking became routine. The connection to living processes became something too valuable to abandon when convenience returned. The wild yeasts that had found millions of new homes during those months of isolation continued their patient work in kitchens around the world. Proof that some partnerships are too fundamental to human well-being to be permanently displaced by industrial efficiency, too satisfying to be replaced by commercial convenience, too deeply rooted in human nature to disappear completely, no matter how thoroughly modern life attempts to eliminate them. The thread that connected these home bakers to 5,000 years of fermentation tradition was as real and vital as it had ever been, carried not in museums or textbooks, but in living cultures that bubbled quietly on kitchen counters, maintained by people who had rediscovered what their ancestors had always known, that some of the most important work in the world is invisible, patient, collaborative, and essential to human flourishing in ways that go far beyond simple nutrition. I remember when bread became biography, when the simple mixture of flour and water in ceramic crocks began to carry stories more complex than any written history, more personal than any family photograph, more enduring than any monument carved from stone. In kitchens around the world, sourdough starters had evolved from practical necessities into treasured heirlooms, living artifacts that connected present moments to distant pasts through the patient work of invisible creatures who had no understanding of sentiment, but who preserved memory more faithfully than any human institution. The stories that grew around these maintained cultures reflected humanity's deep need to believe in continuity, to find tangible connections to times and places that existed now only in imagination. Carl Griffith's Oregon Trail starter became the most famous of these living legends, a culture supposedly maintained since 1847, carried across the American continent by pioneers who faced challenges that made daily bread a matter of survival rather than convenience. Griffith himself had inherited the culture from a friend who claimed unbroken lineage back to the original wagon trains, to families who had carried their fermentation partners in wooden containers wrapped against their bodies through river crossings and mountain passes, through attacks and storms and all the hardships that westward migration imposed. Whether the lineage was truly unbroken mattered less than what it represented, the understanding that some partnerships are too valuable to abandon, too essential to lose, too deeply rooted in human survival to disappear simply because circumstances become difficult. I can see the care with which such cultures were maintained, passed from generation to generation like family treasures that required not storage but attention, not preservation but participation. The elderly woman teaching her daughter to read the signs of healthy fermentation was transferring more than technique, she was sharing membership in an invisible community that stretched backward through time, connecting the present moment to every baker who had ever tended the same living culture. The claims became more elaborate as the romance of antiquity increased their appeal. Starters supposedly descended from cultures that had survived the Black Death, that had been maintained in medieval monasteries, that had traveled the Silk Road with merchant caravans, that carried within their microscopic communities the memory of ancient civilizations. The marketing potential of such stories was undeniable. Who wouldn't want to bake bread with the same yeasts that had risen in Roman ovens or Egyptian temples? But the science that revealed the secret life of microbes also clarified the reality behind these romantic claims. The wild yeasts and bacteria that worked in sourdough starters were indeed ancient, but not in the way that storytellers suggested. Individual microorganisms lived for hours or days, not centuries. Each feeding cycle refreshed the entire population, replacing old cells with new ones, maintaining the community while constantly renewing its membership. The age of a starter referred not to individual organisms, but to the continuity of the lineage, to the unbroken chain of feeding and maintenance that kept particular strains alive through countless generations of microscopic reproduction. A culture that had been maintained for 100 years contained the descendants of the original wild yeasts and bacteria, shaped by a century of adaptation to specific conditions, selected for characteristics that made them successful in partnership with human hands. I remember the moment when microbiologists first explained this distinction to bakers who had cherished their ancient cultures. The mix of disappointment and wonder that came with understanding that their starters were simultaneously newer and older than they had imagined. The individual creatures were constantly being renewed, but the communities they formed carried information that had indeed been passed down through generations, genetic instructions refined by decades or centuries of successful fermentation. The modern preservation societies that emerged to maintain and distribute historical cultures understood this scientific reality while honoring the cultural significance of continuous lineage. Organizations like the Sourdough Library began collecting and cataloging starter cultures from around the world, creating repositories where important strains could be preserved, even if they're original, maintainers could no longer care for them. These preservation efforts reflected a growing awareness that sourdough cultures represented more than individual family traditions they were living. Libraries of fermentation knowledge, repositories of microbial diversity that had been shaped by specific geographic and cultural conditions. A starter that had been maintained in San Francisco for a century was different from one that had developed in rural Vermont or urban New York, not because of mythical terroir, but because of real adaptation to local conditions, local flour, local handling techniques. The free distribution that characterized most of these preservation societies embodied the communal spirit that had always surrounded sourdough sharing. Unlike commercial yeast, which was manufactured and sold as a commodity, starter cultures were traditionally given rather than sold, shared freely among bakers who understood that their own success depended on the health of the broader community of fermentation partners. I can see the networks that formed as people began sharing portions of their maintained cultures through mail systems and online communities, creating connections between strangers who were united by their commitment to maintaining living traditions. The person who received a dried sample of someone else's starter was accepting responsibility, not just for their own bread making, but for the continuation of a partnership that might represent generations of careful maintenance. The rehydration process that brought these dried cultures back to life was a small miracle that never lost its capacity to inspire wonder. The dormant microorganisms that seemed lifeless in their desiccated state would begin to bubble and rise within hours of being fed with fresh flour and water, proving that the partnerships they represented were more resilient than they appeared, more enduring than the circumstances that had temporarily suspended their activity. But the most remarkable aspect of these living heirlooms was not their antiquity, real or imagined, but their adaptability. The wild yeasts and bacteria that had survived in maintained cultures had demonstrated an capacity for flexibility that allowed them to work successfully in kitchens around the world with different flours, different climates, different techniques, different expectations. A culture that had developed its characteristics in 19th century California could learn to thrive in 21st century apartments heated by forced air and lit by electric bulbs. The microorganisms had no attachment to historical authenticity, number preference for traditional methods over modern conveniences. They simply continued their patient work of fermentation, adapting to whatever conditions their human partners provided, maintaining their essential capabilities while adjusting to new circumstances. I remember the satisfaction that people found in maintaining these living connections to the past, the daily ritual of feeding that created continuity between ordinary moments and extraordinary history. The starter that bubbled quietly on a kitchen counter was simultaneously ancient and immediate, connecting its maintainer to 5,000 years of human fermentation. Experience while requiring attention in the present moment. The bread that emerged from these carefully maintained cultures carried within its risen structure not just nourishment but narrative, not just calories but culture, not just sustenance but story. Each loaf was a chapter in an ongoing biography that began with wild yeasts settling in forgotten grain, paste, and continued through. Every baker who had ever learned to work in partnership with invisible life. The children who watched their parents tend these living cultures were witnessing more than bread making. They were observing the maintenance of tradition, the daily commitment that preservation requires, the patient work of keeping alive something that could easily be lost through neglect or indifference. Whether they would continue the practice themselves remained to be seen. But they were learning that some responsibilities transcend individual convenience, that some partnerships are worth maintaining even when easier alternatives exist. The wild yeasts that worked in these modern kitchens had no understanding of their historical significance, no awareness of the stories that had grown up around their invisible labor. They simply continued the work they had been doing for millions of years before humans existed, transforming complex carbohydrates into simpler compounds, producing carbon dioxide and organic acids as byproducts of their own metabolism. But the humans who maintained them understood that they were custodians of something precious, participants in partnerships that connected them to the deepest roots of human civilization. The daily feeding was both practical necessity and spiritual practice, both individual choice and community responsibility, both personal satisfaction and cultural preservation. And in the quiet moments when fresh flour was stirred into bubbly starter, when the ancient dance of fermentation resumed its patient rhythm, the thread that connected present to past remained unbroken, carried forward not by institutions or monuments, but by ordinary people who understood that some traditions are too valuable to abandon, too essential to lose, too deeply rooted in human experience to disappear as long as someone is willing to provide the daily attention that keeps them alive. So that's the story, not polished or glorious, but worn, wind-beaten, and real. 5,000 years of partnership between human hands and wild nature, carried forward not through grand gestures, but through daily feeding, patient waiting, quiet commitment to processes larger than individual understanding. The wild yeasts that first settled in that forgotten bowl beside the Nile have traveled farther than any human explorer, adapted to more environments than any cultivated crop, survived more disasters than any human institution. They work tonight in kitchens around the world, transforming flour and water into daily miracles with the same patient chemistry. They have been performing since civilization began. I remember the thread that connects all these moments, the Egyptian baker discovering that abandoned dough had become something alive, the Roman pisters learning to work with foreign techniques, the medieval guilds preserving knowledge through dark centuries, the gold rush miners carrying life against their hearts through bitter wilderness, Louise Boudin rescuing her precious culture from burning San Francisco, the home bakers of pandemic lockdown rediscovering skills their grandparents took for granted. The story continues tonight in your kitchen, if you choose to join it, in the starter that bubbles quietly on your counter, in the daily ritual of feeding that connects you to generations of bakers who faced the same challenges, discovered the same solutions, found the same satisfaction in working with living processes that cannot be hurried or controlled, but only tended with patient hands. The wild yeasts remember nothing and everything. They carry no conscious memory of their journey from the Nile to your kitchen counter, but they embody 5,000 years of successful partnership with human civilization. They are the same species that raised bread for pharaohs and peasants, for Roman legions and medieval monasteries, for gold rush miners and modern home bakers. If you're still with me, thank you for sharing this quiet hour and letting the past drift across your night. I hope somewhere in the dust of ancient bakeries, in the heroic rescues from burning cities, in the patient work of invisible creatures transforming simple ingredients into something greater than themselves, you found a little peace. The thread runs on tomorrow, in kitchens around the world, People will feed their starters, and shape their loaves, and tend their ovens, continuing the ancient partnership that connects us all to something larger and more enduring than our individual lives. The wild yeasts will continue their patient work, proving once again that some relationships transcend time. Some collaborations improve with age, some partnerships grow stronger rather than weaker with each passing generation. If this helped you sleep, or if you simply enjoyed the stillness of remembering when bread was alive, when fermentation was mystery, when the most sophisticated technology was the kind that learned to work with natural processes rather than against them, please know that you are part of the story now. Whether you maintain a starter or simply understand its significance, whether you bake your own bread or simply appreciate those who do, you are connected to the endless thread that began beside the Nile and continues wherever people choose patience over speed, partnership over control, living process over industrial efficiency. The starters bubble quietly tonight, tended by people who understand that some work is invisible, essential, endless. The wild yeasts transform flour into possibility, water into hope, time into nourishment. The ancient partnership continues, carried forward not by museums or monuments, but by ordinary people who choose to participate in something extraordinary. The daily miracle of making bread that connects past to present, human skill to wild nature, individual kitchens to the long story of human civilization. Sleep well, there are more stories to come. Maybe older, maybe stranger, maybe even more patient, but still slow, still true. Still waiting for someone to remember that the most important partnerships are often the most invisible ones. The most essential work is often the most humble work. The most enduring traditions are often the ones maintained, not by grand institutions, but by quiet people who understand that some things are too precious to lose, too valuable to abandon, too deeply rooted in human flourishing. To deeply rooted in human flourishing, to disappear as long as someone is willing to feed them, and the day after day out as every dad by and at by weighing available where there will be out with well with all with all with to it with all to will with it what will all out go fuck